January 17, 1945. Somewhere along the frost-cracked roads of the Rhineland. The wind carried ash and silence. A column of German army nurses trudged westward through ankle-deep slush, their gray woolen capes heavy with moisture, their faces hollowed by exhaustion. They had walked for 3 days since the field hospital at Euskirchen collapsed under American artillery fire. Their boots, once polished to regulation shine, were now split at the seams, bound with strips of tent canvas. One nurse, Schwester Margarethe Vogel, clutched a leather medical bag against her chest, not because it contained supplies, for there were none left, but because it was the last remnant of her profession, the last proof that she had once been something other than a refugee. Behind them, the horizon glowed dull orange. Not sunrise? The Americans were burning supply depots. The nurses did not look back. They had learned not to look back. When the jeeps appeared, grinding up the muddy road with their white stars gleaming like accusations, Margarethe felt her heart lurch, not from fear, but from something worse. Relief. Shame at relief. The surrender had already happened in her body before her mind could protest. An American officer stood in the lead vehicle, one hand braced against the windshield, his face ruddy and clean-shaven. He looked impossibly young. He looked impossibly well-fed. "Hands up!" someone shouted in clumsy German. "You are prisoners of war." Margarethe raised her hands. The medical bag slipped from her fingers into the mud. In the winter of 1945, as the Third Reich contracted toward its final agony, tens of thousands of German military nurses found themselves swept into the great westward migration of defeat. These women, many of them volunteers, who had joined the Schwesternschaft des Deutschen Roten Kreuzes in the fervent days of 1939 and 1940, had served in field hospitals from Stalingrad to Normandy, from North Africa to the Ardennes. They had amputated limbs without anesthesia. They had sorted the dying from the salvable in triage tents lit by kerosene lamps. They had written final letters for boys who would never see home again. They had believed, with the intensity of those who stake their youth on a single truth, that they were serving something noble, the fatherland, duty, the new Europe. Now that belief was collapsing, and with it something more fundamental, their understanding of themselves. The American and British armies advancing into Germany in early 45 captured not only soldiers but entire support infrastructures, hospitals, supply depots, administrative units. Among these prisoners were thousands of women, nurses, communications specialists, clerical staff. For the victorious Allies, these women posed a unique challenge. The Geneva Convention mandated humane treatment of medical personnel, but practical questions loomed. Where to house them? How to process them? And, perhaps most uncomfortably, how to reconcile the propaganda image of the brutal Nazi with the reality of exhausted young women in threadbare uniforms. The solution, implemented across dozens of POW camps from the Rhineland to Bavaria, was as pragmatic as it was psychologically complex. German nurses would be interned in repurposed barracks, schoolhouses, and requisitioned estates. They would be guarded, documented, and eventually released. But in the interim, they would live under American administration. And it was in this administration, in the small daily mechanics of captivity, that something unexpected occurred. The humiliation was not intentional. That was perhaps what made it unbearable. Margarethe Vogel and 43 other nurses arrived at a transit camp near Remagen on January 20th. The facility had once been a Hitler Youth Training Center, all hard angles and austere concrete, now festooned with American flags and hand-painted signs in English. The nurses were herded into a processing hall where they stood for 4 hours while clerks typed their information onto forms. Name, rank, service history, medical qualifications, any infectious diseases? A translator asked mechanically. "No," Margarethe whispered. Louder. "No." The translator made a check mark. "Barracks C. Move along." Barracks C had been a dormitory for 16-year-old boys preparing for military service. Now it housed 36 women ranging in age from 19 to 47. The room was long and narrow, with iron bunk beds arranged in 2 rows. Someone had removed the Hitler Youth banners, leaving rectangular shadows on the walls. The windows were intact but filthy. The floor was gritty with tracked-in mud. In one corner, a bucket served as a latrine. The women claimed bunks in silence. Margarethe chose an upper bunk near the center of the room. Not too close to the door, not too close to the bucket. She lay down fully clothed, her body aching, and stared at the ceiling. Water stains bloomed across the plaster like maps of countries that no longer existed. That first night, no one spoke. They were too tired, too defeated. But more than that, they were German. And Germans, even in collapse, maintained order through silence. The Americans arrived the next morning with cleaning supplies. Margarethe was dozing when the door banged open. She jolted upright, her pulse spiking. Some animal part of her brain still expected artillery. Instead, 3 American soldiers entered carrying mops, brooms, buckets of soapy water, and an industrial-sized can of disinfectant. They were all young, maybe 20 or 21. One was black, which startled several of the nurses, though no one said anything. One had red hair and freckles. The third was short and stocky with a Brooklyn accent. "Morning, ladies," the redhead said in English. He grinned. "Looks like this place could use some spit and polish." The translator, a German-American corporal who had been born in Milwaukee, stood in the doorway. "These men are here to clean your quarters," he announced in German. "You will stand outside while they work." Margarethe stared. "We can clean," she said. The corporal shrugged. "Orders." "Outside, please." The nurses shuffled into the cold courtyard. They stood in a loose cluster, arms crossed, watching through the window as the American soldiers set to work. The black soldier started sweeping, pushing great arcs of dirt toward the door. The redhead mopped the floor in long, efficient strokes. The stocky one climbed onto a bunk and began scrubbing the windows with a rag and vinegar solution. They worked quickly. They worked cheerfully. The redhead whistled something, swing music maybe. The stocky one made a joke that Margarethe couldn't hear, and the other 2 laughed. "They are cleaning," one of the younger nurses murmured. "They are men, and they are cleaning." Margarethe said nothing. She watched the black soldier pause to wring out his mop, watched the muscles in his forearms flex, watched the way he moved with unself-conscious competence. In Germany, in the world she had known, soldiers did not mop floors. Orderlies mopped floors. Prisoners mopped floors. Women mopped floors. Soldiers gave orders and fought and died. The boundary was sacred, but these men were not humiliated by the work. That was the thing. They were not resentful or embarrassed. They simply did it, the way one might perform any task that needed doing. After 40 minutes, the redhead emerged and gave a thumbs up. "All clean, ladies. Have a good day," the translator gestured. "You may return inside." Margarethe entered the barracks. The smell hit her first, sharp, chemical, clean. The floor gleamed wetly. The windows were translucent for the first time in months, letting in cold, clear light. Someone had even emptied the latrine bucket and replaced it with a fresh one lined with a paper bag. She stood in the center of the room, trembling. The cleaning continued. Every 3 days, American soldiers arrived with supplies and scrubbed the barracks from end to end. Every 3 days, the nurses stood outside and watched men perform tasks they had been taught were beneath male dignity. Some of the women were grateful. They were exhausted, after all, and the cleanliness was objectively better for morale and hygiene. But gratitude curdled into something more complex. Resentment. Confusion. A kind of smoldering shame that no one could articulate. "They think we are filthy," one nurse, Schwester Ilse, said bitterly on the 4th day. "They think we cannot take care of ourselves." "They think we are children," another added. "They think we are animals," a third spat. Margarethe said nothing. She was not sure what she thought. She only knew that every time the Americans came with their mops and their cheerful efficiency, something inside her twisted tighter. The shame was not rational. It was not about the cleaning itself. It was about what the cleaning represented. In the world the nurses had been raised in, the world of rigid roles and hierarchical certainties, men who cleaned were emasculated, and women who required cleaning were incompetent. To be cleaned by men was to occupy both categories at once, to be simultaneously coddled and despised, but the Americans did not despise them. That was the unbearable part. The Americans treated the cleaning as a mundane logistical task, no different from distributing rations or repairing a fence. There was no contempt in their efficiency. There was no pity in their whistling, and perhaps that was worse. To be pitied would have confirmed the nurses' understanding of the world, a world where strength dominated weakness, where victors humiliated the vanquished. But this casual competence, this cheerful equality of labor, it destabilized everything. The food arrived next. On January 28th, the camp received a shipment of American field rations. The nurses had been subsisting on watery soup and black bread, not starvation, but not sustenance either. The Americans distributed K-rations, small, cardboard boxes containing crackers, canned meat, cheese, chocolate, cigarettes, and gum. Margarethe opened her box on her bunk, her hands trembling slightly. The chocolate was wrapped in waxed paper, smooth and dark. She had not seen real chocolate in 2 years. She broke off a square and placed it on her tongue. It melted, rich and sweet, almost obscenely decadent. Across the room, Schwester Ilse bit into a stick of chewing gum and burst into tears. The abundance was incomprehensible. Not just the quantity, though there was plenty, but the casualness of it. The Americans distributed these rations as if they were nothing, as if every soldier in their army ate like this every day. And perhaps they did. The prisoners began to whisper about what they had seen. American trucks filled with food. American supply depots stacked to the ceiling. American soldiers throwing away half-eaten meals. Where does it come from? One nurse wondered aloud. America, Ilse said bitterly. The country that never saw a bomb. But Margarethe thought about the black soldier with the mop, the redhead with the whistle, the stocky one with the jokes. She thought about how they had worked without resentment, without hierarchy, without the rigid cruelty that had defined every German military interaction she had ever witnessed. And she wondered if the abundance and the cleaning were connected. If a society that did not divide labor into sacred and profane categories, that did not hoard dignity like a scarce resource, could also produce enough food to throw half of it away. She did not voice this thought. It felt treasonous. By February, the camp had settled into a grim routine. The nurses cleaned, though the Americans still arrived every 3 days to do the heavy scrubbing, and they waited. Waited for processing, for release, for some clarity about what came next. The war was still happening somewhere in the distance, but it felt abstract, like a story told in a foreign language. The Americans brought newspapers, censored, of course, but still. The nurses gathered around the pages, trying to decode the truth from the propaganda. Berlin was under siege. The Eastern Front had collapsed. American and Soviet forces were closing in from both sides. "It is over," Ilse said flatly. "We lost." "We knew we lost," Margarethe replied. "No," Ilse said. "We knew we were losing. Now we have lost." There is a difference. There was. The difference was ontological. To be losing was to still exist in narrative time, in the realm of struggle and possibility. To have lost was to exist in the past tense, to be a historical object rather than a historical subject. The nurses were becoming artifacts of a defeated ideology, relics of a system that had consumed their youth and spat them out into the mud. On February 14th, an American chaplain visited the camp. He was a Lutheran minister from Minnesota, middle-aged and soft-spoken, with wire-rimmed glasses and a gentle demeanor. He gathered the nurses in the mess hall and delivered a short sermon in halting German. He spoke about forgiveness, about grace, about the possibility of rebuilding. "You are not your government," he said. "You are children of God." Some of the women wept. Others stared at him with hollow eyes. Margarethe felt a flicker of anger. Easy for him to say. He had not lived through the years of indoctrination, the relentless propaganda, the social pressure to conform. He had not bet his entire youth on a cause that turned out to be monstrous. But then he said something that lodged in her chest like a splinter. "The question is not whether you can be forgiven," he said. "The question is whether you can forgive yourselves." In March, the Americans installed showers, proper showers, with hot water and soap. The nurses were escorted in groups of 10 to a repurposed schoolhouse, where a field engineering unit had rigged up a plumbing system. Margarethe stood under the spray, eyes closed, and let the heat soak into her skin. She had not been truly warm in months. When she emerged, wrapped in a rough towel, she saw her reflection in a fogged mirror. She looked skeletal. Her cheekbones jutted. Her hair, once thick and blonde, was lank and brittle. But she was clean. For the first time in months, she was clean. An American nurse, a real nurse, a lieutenant in the Army Nurse Corps, stood nearby, distributing fresh clothing. She was in her 30s, brisk and professional, with auburn hair pinned in a regulation bun. "Here," she said, in accented German, handing Margarethe a set of clean undergarments and a simple gray dress. "This should fit." Margarethe took the clothes. "Thank you," she whispered. The American nurse paused. "What is your name?" "Margarethe Vogel. I am Lieutenant Anderson." She studied Margarethe for a moment. "You were a nurse?" "Yes." "Good nurses?" Margarethe hesitated. "I tried to be." Lieutenant Anderson nodded. "Then you understand. We do what we can with what we have. That is all any of us can do." It was a small kindness, a brief recognition of shared professional identity. But it cracked something in Margarethe's chest. She dressed quickly, blinking back tears, and returned to the barracks. The symbolic object, the thing that threaded through every day, was soap. American soap. White, rectangular bars embossed with the letters U.S. and a faint scent of lye. The Americans distributed it freely. 1 bar per person per week, as if soap were infinite, as if cleanliness were a birthright rather than a luxury. Margarethe kept her bar on the windowsill beside her bunk. She used it sparingly, cutting thin slivers with a pocket knife to make it last. But the abundance troubled her. In Germany, soap had been rationed since 1941. Civilians made do with harsh substitutes that left skin red and cracked. Soldiers received tiny allotments that had to be stretched across weeks. Soap was scarcity made tangible. But here, in captivity, soap was plentiful. The Americans washed their hands a dozen times a day. They laundered uniforms weekly. They cleaned floors, cleaned vehicles, cleaned weapons, cleaned everything with a zeal that bordered on obsessive. It was as if cleanliness were a form of ideology, a secular religion, and perhaps it was. Perhaps a society that valued every individual's right to hygiene, that did not stratify cleanliness along hierarchies of worth, was fundamentally different from one that hoarded soap for the Aryan elite and denied it to the Untermensch. Margarethe turned the soap bar over in her hands, feeling the slick smoothness, smelling the faint chemical tang. Such a small thing. Such an enormous thing. In April, the news came. Hitler was dead. The war in Europe was over. The camp erupted into chaos, not celebration, but a kind of frenzied grief. Some women sobbed, others laughed hysterically. Ilse smashed her fist into a wall and broke 2 knuckles. Margarethe sat on her bunk, numb, and stared at the soap bar. The Americans did not gloat. That was perhaps the strangest thing. There were no victory parades in the camp, no triumphalist speeches. The guards simply continued their routines, distributing rations, organizing mail call, escorting prisoners to medical checkups. Business as usual. A week later, they began processing releases. The nurses lined up to receive discharge papers, travel permits, and a small stipend in occupation currency. One by one, they filed out of the camp and into the shattered landscape of post-war Germany. Margarethe was released on April 29th. She stood at the camp gate, holding her medical bag and a small bundle of belongings, and looked back. The barracks were empty now, the windows dark. In a few weeks, the camp would be repurposed for something else. The war was over, but the machinery of reconstruction was just beginning. She walked west, toward the city of Koblenz, where her sister lived, or had lived, before the bombing. The roads were clogged with displaced persons, former soldiers, refugees, concentration camp survivors, bombed-out civilians. Everyone was going somewhere, though few seemed to know where. As she walked, Margarethe thought about the American soldiers, with their mops, the black soldier with his unself-conscious competence, the redhead with his cheerful whistle. She thought about Lieutenant Anderson and the chaplain and the endless bars of soap. She thought about the humiliation of being cleaned, the shame of abundance, the unbearable kindness of enemies who did not act like enemies, and she realized, with a clarity that felt like falling, that she had been wrong, not just about the war, that was obvious, but about something deeper. She had believed that strength required cruelty, that order required hierarchy, that dignity required domination. She had believed that a society was strong only insofar as it was ruthless. But the Americans, for all their faults, had shown her something different. They had shown her a society that could be powerful without being sadistic, efficient without being inhumane, victorious without being vengeful. They had treated her, not as an object of contempt or pity, but as a person who needed a clean floor and hot water and a bar of soap. It was not mercy. It was something stranger and more subversive. It was equality. Years later, in the 1960s, when historians began interviewing German POWs about their experiences of American captivity, a recurring theme emerged. It was not the food, though the food was often mentioned. It was not the medical care, though that too was noted. It was the small domestic labors, the cleaning, the laundry, the maintenance. The way American soldiers performed tasks that German military culture had coded as feminine or servile, and did so without shame. One former nurse, interviewed in 1967, described it this way: "They cleaned our quarters as if it were normal, as if men and women were both human beings who lived in spaces that needed cleaning." It sounds absurd, but it was revolutionary. Another, interviewed in 1972, said, "I was humiliated because I had been taught that to be served was to be weak. But they did not serve us out of weakness. They served us because it needed doing, and they were there." I realized later that this was freedom, not the grand political kind, but the small, daily kind. The freedom to do what needs doing without consulting a hierarchy of shame. Margarethe Vogel never gave an interview. She moved to Koblenz, trained as a midwife, and spent the next 30 years delivering babies in the rebuilt hospitals of the Rhineland. She married, had 2 daughters, and lived quietly. She kept the bar of soap from the camp for the rest of her life, wrapped in waxed paper, tucked in a drawer beside her marriage certificate and her daughter's birth records. When she died in 1989, just months before the Berlin Wall fell, her daughters found the soap among her belongings. They did not understand its significance. They threw it away, but the lesson remained, coded into the small gestures of her life. The way she treated her patients with dignity, regardless of class or background. The way she insisted that her husband share equally in domestic labor, scandalous in the 1950s, but normal by the 1970s. The way she taught her daughters that strength and kindness were not opposites, that power could be gentle, that the true measure of a society was not how it treated its heroes, but how it treated its prisoners. The humiliation of being cleaned was the humiliation of having one's worldview dismantled by kindness. It was the shame of realizing that everything you had been taught about strength and weakness, about order and chaos, about who deserved dignity and who did not, was a lie. The Americans did not intend to humiliate the German nurses. They intended to provide humane conditions for prisoners of war. But in doing so, in cleaning floors and distributing soap and treating captive enemies like human beings, they performed a kind of ideological warfare more devastating than any artillery. Barrage. They showed that another world was possible, a world where labor was not a punishment, where cleanliness was not a luxury, where dignity was not earned through domination, but granted through simple recognition of shared humanity. And for women who had staked their youth on the opposite belief, who had served a regime built on hierarchy and exclusion and the ruthless suppression of empathy, this revelation was unbearable. Not because it was cruel, but because it was true. The soap, the mops, the hot water, the bars of chocolate, these were not instruments of humiliation. They were instruments of transformation. They were the mundane, material evidence that ideology could be wrong, that the structures one had taken for eternal and natural were in fact contingent and constructed. And once you saw that, once you understood that the world could be remade, you could never fully return to the old certainties. You were changed, humiliated, yes, but also liberated, stripped of illusions, but also granted the terrifying freedom to imagine something better. This was the true defeat, not the collapse of the regime, not the occupation, not the trials and the reckonings, but the quiet, daily realization that the people you had been taught to see as weak and decadent and unworthy, the Americans with their soap and their swing music and their casual egalitarianism, were in fact stronger, not because they were more brutal, but because they were more human. And in the end, humanity was the only victory that mattered. The nurses left the camps carrying this knowledge like a wound. Some suppressed it, retreating into nostalgia and denial. Others let it fester, allowing bitterness to calcify into permanent resentment. But a few, women like Margarethe Vogel, let it transform them. They carried the bars of soap and the memory of men with mops into the post-war world, and they built something new from the ruins. Not a perfect world, not even a just world, but a world where a German nurse could deliver a Turkish immigrant's baby with the same care she gave to a German banker's child. A world where a woman could insist that her husband wash the dishes without being called a shrew. A world where small, daily acts of equality slowly accumulated into something larger. The war ended in 1945, but the transformation it began, the slow, painful, ongoing work of dismantling hierarchies and reimagining what strength could mean, continued for decades. It continues still, and it began, for some, in a cold barracks in the Rhineland, with American soldiers whistling swing music as they mopped a floor, and German nurses standing outside in the February cold, watching, humiliated, and forever changed.